Hey everyone, Joe here. This is the Truth Seeking with Joe podcast, and I thought I'd make a quick first episode just to kind of explain a little bit about where I'm coming from, why I decided to launch a podcast, the goals that I'm hoping to achieve, that kind of stuff. So, obviously, one of the reasons I'm doing this is to have a platform where I can talk to people that I want to talk to and talk about ideas I think are interesting and maybe learn a little bit more about those ideas and make those ideas accessible to my listeners, right? So, for instance, through Jordan Peterson, I learned a little bit about psychoanalysis. So that's Freud, Jung, and I think Nietzsche is usually in those types of conversations as well. I believe he was Carl Jung's professor at some point, so this may not be a huge surprise. And I'm also fairly interested in philosophy, and I'm hoping to do an episode on critical thinking at some point in the future if I can get a guest who's an expert in philosophy. I'd love to talk to them about critical thinking, logical fallacies, that kind of stuff, right? And yeah, the other reason is to try to show people how to have conversations that are actually fruitful, right? So I have a quote by Sam Harris here that I think really encapsulates that philosophy. He says, "Everything from the maintenance of civilization to the moral progress of our species depends on a series of successful conversations." And I think that's right. I feel like we are getting at a point in our evolution where if we don't get our our act together, right? Well, this might do us in, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to suggest that the fate of our species might actually depend on our ability to have productive conversations, even when there's disagreement, right? And I find the fact that it's so difficult these days to have conversations that are productive, right, about politics or about COVID or anything like that. I find that really worrying. And obviously, I don't think it's the only big danger that's facing us today, right? Obviously, there's a lot of things going on in the world right now, but I do think it's one of the big ones. And hopefully, with my podcast, I can kind of show people how to have those types of conversations. And there's actually a couple of techniques and algorithms that you can follow if you want to have meaningful conversations that actually lead you a little bit closer to the truth and where you begin to converge on the truth, right? So one of them, it's known by many names. It's one of Rappaport's rules. So Anatole Rappaport was a game theorist, and he has some rules for critical discourse, and those were popularized by Dan Dennett, the philosopher. And the first rule is this: you should attempt to re express your target's position so clearly, vividly, and fairly that your target says, "Thanks, I wish I thought of putting it that way." So some of you guys might recognize this as steel manning, right? So steel manning, that's the opposite of straw manning, which is a logical fallacy. When you straw man someone's argument, you're taking its weakest interpretation and then you're attacking that. But it seems to me that if you're a truth seeker, that's not really a good idea, because if there's any truth whatsoever to your opponent's perspective or claims or argument, then you're not really doing yourself any favors by making a caricature of that person's argument and then attacking that, right? So the opposite of that is steel manning, which is going back to Rappaport's first rules. If you can articulate your opponent's argument in a way that he agrees with, then you've shown that you've made an effort to understand their perspective. And maybe by making their argument stronger, you can make your own argument stronger, right? So I think it's a win-win for everyone that's involved. And you see a lot of straw manning in mainstream media and politics, and it's really not good. I mean, there's a lot of logical fallacies that are, I mean, they're all counterproductive almost by definition, but you look at the more philosophical circles and you see a lot of steel manning happening regularly, right? You look at the live event that Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris did a couple of years ago. They did 2 in Vancouver and 2 in Europe, and they actually began most of those conversations by steel manning the other person's argument. And I think they did a good job, and I think that those two guys actually serve as really good models. These, like, this is how we should have conversations, right? They had I mean, including the two podcasts that they did, they have about 12 hours of, well, that, actually, it's actually not quite right because Peterson actually released a podcast with Harris a couple of weeks ago. So now they have 7 public conversations. And if you guys are familiar with those philosophers, you guys might guess what they talked about. The relationship between facts and values it seems to come up in, almost every conversation that they have. But anyway, William Lane Craig, he's a Christian theologian. He went on Ben Shapiro's Sunday Special a couple of years ago, and as some of you might know, Craig is a very, very famous Christian theologian. He's very smart. He's got 2 PhDs. I believe he has one in theology and one in philosophy. And so, as you can imagine, he's quite well read. And Shapiro asked him to give him the strongest argument for the existence of God, and he did because he's a cosmologist. And then Shapiro asked him to steelman the atheist argument, and he did, which again, not a huge surprise, right? So obviously steelmanning, it can be difficult to do. And if anyone's ever had a heated conversation or debate with someone, they know that when emotions run high, it's not always easy to try to steer towards rationality, right? But I do think that it's worth the effort. And so, yeah, that's one technique that I'll be talking about, and hopefully, to the best of my ability, try to use if I ever have a disagreement with someone on my podcast, right? And so that's mainly what I'm going for. And hopefully I can do a good enough job at it. And I'm not going to pretend to be a perfect conversationalist or that there's never any room for improvement, right? But I'm going to do my best and we'll see how it goes. So I'll see you guys soon.